we're here to have a conversation. And first of all, I just want to recognize that we do have our support team here with us, and they can go ahead and introduce themselves real quick. But this will be a youth-led conversation, so all of the youth you see here will be asking questions and kind of leading this discussion. We thank you for coming on today, taking time out of your day. Okay.
Go first. I'm David Miyashiro. I'm the executive director of Hawaii Kids Can. We're a local nonprofit that focuses on education policy and particularly youth empowerment. So it's been a real honor and pleasure to be working with these great young leaders.
I can go next. Aloha mai kako. My name is Lala Nas. Thank you for joining this group today. I work for the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability and Resiliency as a Climate Resilience and Equity Manager, and have been had the fortunate opportunity in working with this group of youth over the past couple months around civic engagement and community forums. So I'm here to just continue to support them in the very important work they're doing. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lauren Ballesteros Watanabe. I'm the program manager and community organizer with Sierra Club Oahu Group. So we're an environmental justice organization, and so privileged, as others shared in the support team, to be working with these youth and taking on these conversations and having people like you to help understand these very heavy topics. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, support team. So now we'll go ahead. They'll be muting themselves for the rest of the conversation, and now we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. So my name is Jonah Larica. I attend UH Mānoa, and I currently live in Aikea.
Hi, my name is Anna Chua. I am also a student at UH Mānoa, and I was born and raised in Malaysia, but I now live on Oahu.
Hi, my name is Erin Enriquez. I go to school in American University in Washington, D.C., and I'm from Pearl City, Hawaii.
Awesome, and I am Karen Abe. I have gone to UH Mānoa for the past 2 years, but will be transferring to the University of Southern California this upcoming fall. I am born and raised here in Honolulu, Hawaii. And to get us started, just to give us background about who we are as a team. We are part of the Youth Public Policy and Advocacy Group. We do a lot of series of youth-led initiatives to engage in public policies, development with social justice and equity, all at once. Our purpose is for youth to grow their leadership skills, build relationships with like-minded activists, island-wide, as you can see, and work collaboratively on community-centered policy action. We really want to encourage youth to vote too. So we're so happy to have you here so we can, have robust discussion about everything going on right now.
Definitely. Now, just to add on to that, so the first part of this series, the community change forums, we took place back in April. And so we had youth-led discussions amongst youth within council districts, as well as an Earth Day community change forum, where we talked about some of the issues that are currently facing Hawaii and some of the things that youth would like to see in the future and development of this place. So we definitely think that the current election cycle is very unique, and there's, as you may know, that there is a lot of things that are going around this world that have inspired youth to stand up and to use their voice. And our goal here is to hopefully uplift the voices of those in our community, as well as provide them an opportunity to understand, what's going on in this world and what steps they can look forward to, or things that they can do in the future to empower their own voices. So, yeah.
And with that being said, we have our expert today that we are interviewing. Her name is Monisha. We'll be interviewing her regarding all the issues that Hawaii and our country is facing today. So, Monisha, do you have anything you'd like to say? Talk about your work or anything?
Yeah, I am super excited about meeting all of you. It's been a few months since I've met with Aikea folks in person, and I have been keeping sort of keeping abreast of the efforts to influence, especially policy. The push by youth to do that, as well as sort of bring more sort of progressive people into government, right? Like that's sort of the goal, and it's very, very exciting and encouraging to hear, how much effort you've put in despite the pandemic. I know that, many of you have responsibilities at home, you have, your schoolwork. So it's been challenging to say the least, but this is also a time, I noticed that to protest, to sort of clarify what is important for us as social justice workers. So I find that really encouraging, because these are very depressing times, and what gives me heart is your work. So yeah, I just wanted to I read through the Google Doc, and your beautiful statement that prefaces the questions. I was just sort of, very interested in, sort of particular issues that speak to you as youth, or, what is calling out to you at this moment, just to have a little bit of traction so that I'm speaking to your interests and needs.
Of course, yeah, for sure. So definitely we're going to be talking about a lot of it pertaining to social justice issues within the country as well as within our state, to kind of allow youth to have a better understanding of what is going on in this current situation. So I guess with your work and your expertise, like how would you, what is your image of social justice, I guess, as a starting point for this conversation?
Yeah, so, my image of social justice is very intersectional, by which I mean that, we sort of understand that all these structures of domination are interlinked. So, capitalism, racism, misogyny, all of these things are interlinked, and, how do we sort of strategically sort of dismantle them? So that's, and not only dismantle, because that is just sort of the taking down, right? But what do we put in place? So, definitely my visions of justice is very informed by feminist principles, where we start from the most marginalized people who've been most marginalized by these structures of domination, and then sort of see social justice through their lens. So, I kind of see my work more as sort of trying to channel that voice and, figure out and learn from, what people are saying about their own experiences.
Yeah, thank you. So I understand that some of your work has to do with immigration and migrants. So could you, I guess, kind of talk about that and how that pertains to social justice issues that we're facing?
Sure. Yeah, so, the reason that I work with migrants is because I myself, came to this country as a migrant, and have had, sort of some of the experiences that migrant people do have. But I was, I came here to study, and, I have a very different trajectory, say, from, the people about whom I write or with whom I organize, So when I was based in the East Coast, I worked with domestic workers and taxi drivers, and then here, almost as soon as I moved, one of my colleagues in the Department of Ethnic Studies, Dean Allegado, told me that, there is Local 5 Unite Here, and, took me to my first Local 5 meeting. And I have to say that I used to be very, very careful about, unions, because I was only familiar with sort of the bureaucratic model of unionization, right? So, you go to the collective bargaining table and you bargain, and, you don't sort of really engage the workers. So I came in with a lot of reservations and suspicions. I came out of more of a workers' center type of model of organizing, or learning how to organize like that. And then, sort of over these 18 years that I've been here, I have so much respect for the organizing model that has come out of Local 5, and, very honored to have been involved in a series of conversations that led to Aikea, the community base of, this kind of organizing, where, we had conversations about climate justice. We had conversations about, Native Hawaiians and, indigenous rights. These were conversations that don't usually happen in a labor union situation. So, I felt very privileged to have been a part of that. So, that in itself sort of brings a very expansive, notion of how we need to conceptualize workers' rights. So, my focus has always been people who are working in sectors where they're exploited because they are women of color, they're immigrant women, right? So these are, again, all intersectional. And one of the things that I discovered from, my work with domestic workers was that even if they had status, right, and even if they became US citizens, they were still exploited on the basis of their gender and, their race. So, still underpaid, still overworked, still no benefits. So, that was very instructive for me, just to sort of realize that, citizenship doesn't solve everything, because that has become sort of one of the mainstream platforms of the migrant rights movement, right? Like that, as if citizenship is going to solve everything. But my experience with workers have taught me it is not. So, in many ways, while of course, electoral politics is very important, I feel that these sort of larger sort of structures, understanding these larger structures, makes our organizing, much more robust in terms of, it's not just electoral politics. We have to do a lot of pushing back in other policy arenas and really fight for people who are non-citizens. That's my biggest fight. It's like, how do we ensure fair wages, working conditions, healthcare, for people who are not citizens. And we see that even people who are, think of the people who are in prisons or in detention centers and how they're being treated, right? So that in itself has been very instructive for me.
Thank you so much for that interesting dialogue. I guess, Erin, if you have a question.
So we're talking a lot about intersectionality. Where should we carry out these conversations about it? Especially when we're talking about feminization of poverty and migrant workers. Where can we carry out these conversations so that we can bring change to that?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because, intersectionality is almost a sort of academic buzzword, right? But, when we start with our experiences, I feel like many of us can, through talking about our experiences, we understand, I can't really de-link, how I'm treated as a woman from how I'm treated as a woman of color, right? So I feel that those kinds of, starting with one's experience, right? And actually sort of examining, where, what kinds of privileges we have and, where we are oppressed, is really important. So, just to give you an example, I worked with taxi drivers for, before 9/11, like I started to work with them in New York before 9/11 and then afterward. And I remember having this conversation with a driver and saying, I was in upstate New York where it was really racist, and I was a South Asian woman. So, feeling very targeted and sticking out, right? And they were also sharing how they, sort of confronted racial violence against them, and I was like, yeah, I feel really unsafe too, from, this kind of environment. And, and the person very gently pointed out that I had the privilege of being a professor at a university. And, he was in a, basically locked up space in his car where a passenger could attack him, and these attacks were very prevalent, right? So it was a really nice way to think about, on the ground, think about intersectionality, even as I was teaching that in class, So I think one of the things that we learn about intersectionality is that, there are privileges that we have, but there are also ways in which we are oppressed. So how do we sort of bring that into the discussion and recognize our privilege as we are also showing solidarity with people So I think, those conversations that you need to have are very important because, like just to go back and, Lauren was a part of this, like even during Occupy, like Deoccupy Hawaii, we had a long-term, movement here around that. And there were so many debates about what is more important, race or class? Are we trying to dismantle capitalism, or are we going to tackle, colonialism and racism? And it's like this either or formulation that was really not helpful, and, sort of constantly pushing back against that was, again, we developed our analysis and our political sharpness as a result of that.
So talking about, like, I guess in terms of like all like race relations, and as well as like how you talked about like the intersectionalities of like being oppressed as well as stuff, like in terms of like here in Hawaii, like I guess what steps can, I guess, people take if they want to like help fight against that stuff? Like what can youth do to help change that like mindset, I guess you could say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in Hawaii, because the Native Hawaiian sovereignty movement is very visible and very present. I sort of think about the contrast between today. We are doing all this stuff by Zoom, and right around this time last year, we were really sort of activated around the Mana. Right, we were out on the streets. We were organizing. One day a call would go out, a kahea would go out, and so many people would gather, right? So I feel that, for me, coming from the continent, and even on the continent, I had to learn like how racism works in the US as a migrant woman, because that wasn't always clear to me. Coming here, I realized, sovereignty movements are kind of different, right? So they're not like, we can't just treat Native Hawaiians and lump them together with, other racial groups. How do we sort of recognize that, but still sort of, uplift these issues of racial injustice, because racial injustice feeds on capitalism, exploitation of workers, right? And feeds on sexism and feeds on imperialism. So these are all things that, we are experiencing at this moment, and the weight of all of that, I think, is very heavy. And at the same time, I feel that, again, if we start with our experiences, today I was just having a conversation with somebody who was, organizing a protest outside the Philippines consulate here, right? And the ways in which, like we have to think about the United States relationship, like colonial relationship with the Philippines, right? To give context to all of this. Or, why do we see, Filipinx workers here in Hawaii? It has everything to do with imperialism and labor exploitation. So I think that, those are some places to start these conversations. Also, the ways in which anti-Blackness manifests here because of so many Black people being recruited into the military, and, sort of the whole analysis of occupation then kind of like, pits sort of African Americans against others. So I think that these are very interesting tensions that are very particular to Hawaii that we need to sort of spell out and understand and engage with.
So talking about like civic engagement, like how would you improve access to like that civic engagement and inclusive decision making practices like for marginalized populations?
Mm-hmm. So, we are right now in doing sort of research. It's a report that has already been, it's ready to be released by our college. And, I teach in the Department of Ethnic Studies, right? And historically, we've been all about working class people's struggles, right? So my co-author, Richard Rath, who's busy right now, but I hope he can kind of quickly join and talk to you a little bit about this project that we've been doing. It has been about looking at the ways in which hotel workers can be brought back to work without paying any attention to their safety, right? And like we kind of went through all the reports that have been generated in these months, right, when the pandemic has been raging. And it's horrific to realize that the hotels, the corporate sector, the government, the legislators, they have no plan, really, like no well laid out plan. And the hotel workers, from their experience of setting up the temporary quarantine center at EVLA, have experience, and they're developing that into what safety standards should look like, right? And I've gone through all these documents, we've gone through all these documents, and it is striking to see the difference. Like when you understand how hotels can be made safe in the middle of a pandemic so that workers feel safe, their communities feel safe, and therefore guests feel safe. It is, you see how they can think through their work. You see how much thought and all the labor processes are in there in terms of, the level of cleaning, the level of monitoring. So, we feel that, the report is called Workers at the Table, and we feel that it's the workers' voices that should be heard, because they're the ones who are going to do the cleaning. They're the frontline people. So they are the ones who are going to produce that knowledge. And they're the ones who have to influence policy. And you see that they've been constantly marginalized. Like, I texted Kate about, Josh Green has this hui to figure out like how we open up the tourist industry. So is Local 5 a part of it? No.
On that note, we've noticed that BIPOC have been disproportionately affected by COVID and this pandemic in general. Is there anything that you can add to that, or how do we help that situation?
Yeah, it's been really heartbreaking and distressing to see that trend, right? I mean, it's not surprising. We're not surprised to see it, right? And when we look at, structural racism, right? Like why are people getting affected this way? We see they're getting affected this way because they have been neglected, they have been forcibly, sort of put into these really vulnerable situations that expose them, to these viruses and make them more vulnerable to the virus, right? So, again, like, because a lot of my work has been in New York and LA, I see how those cities have been transformed by, COVID-19. It just breaks my heart that, places where I've been to, where I know people, I mean, Jackson Heights was the first place that I did my research, right? And I just learned that like 1 out of 275 people have been affected by COVID in Jackson Heights. And who lives there? It's like immigrant people, people of color, Black people who live there. So, it's really outrageous that this has happened. And there are two things that I want to say in terms of racial justice. Like we really need to push back against conversations that actually blame these people for, their vulnerability to COVID-19, right? So what we see is, there's a lot of conversation about behavioral changes, right? Social distance, which my friends in LA correct me and they say, no, it's not social distance, it's physical distance. We are not socially distanced. I'm talking to you, we are trying to sort of, figure out ways to be still in touch. Physical distance, hand washing, sanitizing, great practices, right? But what about the structural stuff? So we need to, every time these things come up, we need to insert the conversation about what are we going to do with the structures that have put these people in this kind of vulnerable position, which means conversations about healthcare, which means conversations about living wage, which means conversations about unemployment. like we talk about workers, but we know the way in which racial capitalism has worked is actually to force people into unemployment, right? So we see Chicago, New York, like so many people who have been chronically unemployed, right? Chronically not, insured in terms of health. So I think that we need to bring in every opportunity, bring in all the structural, the structures of oppression, right? And the second thing is, all these cultural explanations, right? So I've been very upset with the ways in which Pacific Islander exposure to COVID-19 has been framed in terms of, they don't understand, they just go to church. And so they have a bad culture, right? Like some of their cultural practices have now become bad, and therefore they're being exposed to COVID-19, and therefore it is their fault, right? So are we saying that about like the Southern churches where, Mike Pence just went and spoke? So why are we blaming, like we see the ways in which, sort of race, ethnicity, all of these things are recruited to justify why these people are dying at these high rates, and that just enrages me. I don't know if you wanted me to say more, or if you had some thoughts, because I'm sure all of you are super upset about this.
Yeah, no, I definitely see where you're coming from. And I guess in terms of like our position and our role, I guess like how do you for us, like or not just us, but like other youth, like where do you see the youth playing in a role to fixing these issues, I guess?
Mm-hmm. First doing what you're doing, right? It is, there is a narrative about your generation, right? That the older generation loves to perpetuate. That is that you're self-involved, right? Unengaged, only interested in celebrities and not social issues, right? These are very damaging kinds of images about youth, right? Because you're bearing the burden of all the stuff that we didn't manage to correct. Talk about the climate, talk about, the growth of prisons, talk about the growth of, wealth inequality, whatever it is, like you folks are going to be the ones holding the bag, right? So to say that your generation is unengaged or disinterested because maybe you're not doing the stuff that the people in the 60s were doing, is really wrong. So the first thing I feel is, really pushing back through your presence and through sort of, what you're doing, which is, sort of calling out people and saying, hey, we have really good ideas and you've messed up everything for us. So let's, let's do our part. Like, in many ways, I feel that it is now, our time to take, like in activism or organizing, we have the step up, step back. So I feel that we need to, as the older generation, need to take a step back and actually hear from you and your ideas about how to influence policy. And maybe everything won't be in the policy realm, like policy always goes with cultural shifts, right? So I feel that many of you are also influencing the cultural shifts, right? That you're changing the culture of the ways in which we think about these issues, right? You're moving away from simply, sort of seeing individuals as being, the main actors to these ideas about structures, and, you're talking about, structural forces. So I feel that that's the way in which, that's the enormous potential. And unfortunately, an enormous responsibility that we are now laying on your shoulders, as we look at the next decade. It's really frightening. I mean, I just really feel that, you're growing up with a pandemic, and this is not going to be the last pandemic. You're growing up seeing this kind of, unemployment that you've never seen in your life. You're seeing, the ways in which, our leaders don't care about anything but power grabbing, right? So, and that just reminds me that, the more the newer models of leadership that we can put out there, which is collaborative, where we are talking and, we are actually sort of, understanding that just being a leader or a charismatic leader is not the end all and be all, but actually working together as a collective and making collective change, that collectivization, which is very threatening for the United States. I think that those models of leadership are also very necessary that you are putting forward.
So I know you talked a lot about especially workers' rights here in Hawaii as well as the world. And I guess in our community change forums with youth, one of the biggest concerns were pertaining to jobs within Hawaii and how the current crisis has disproportionately affected those in lower socioeconomic groups. And I guess my question to you is where do you see the community coming together, and what role does the community share in helping solve that issue within our job sector here in Hawaii?
Yeah, and I in the Google Docs, I really like that question where you're provoking some critical thinking about tourism itself, right? As somebody who, has, as I said, over the last 18 years, I have been in solidarity with the hotel workers, and I live in Waikiki, so they're part of my community, right? I go out in the morning and I see them go to work. I come back from work and I see them waiting at bus stops to go back home, tired after their, whole day at work, and they're probably going to go to a second job, right? So I consider them as part of my community, even though they cannot afford to live in Waikiki, they come here and work and then they commute, right? I feel that, of course, we should fight for their jobs. We should fight for, especially at this moment where there is so much uncertainty about whether they're going to be hired back, right? We should fight for, lower room quotas. That's one of the recommendations in our report, because the cleaning is going to be just, elevated levels of cleaning, right? And how to keep them safe. So I completely sympathize with that, but at the same time, or not even sympathize, I'm in solidarity with these, demands. But at the same time, I feel like this is a moment where we really have to think about other ways of building our economy, other ways of thinking about what it, makes us sustainable. So, when I teach, and I say that, tourism, the GDP contribution of tourism is only 23%, which is less than a quarter of the economy, right? But if you talk to people, you'll think that tourism is everything, military and tourism, right? But it's less than a quarter. And the last figures I saw, they are saying it's 17% of the GDP. So why are we elevating tourism to that extent? That's a policy making, that's where policy making and actual data don't match up. Right? So they're inflating how big, how important these things are when they're actually not such a huge driver, right? So, and, sort of even, UHERO, which is, sort of economists coming together at UH, who sort of who weigh in on policy, right? After 9/11, UHERO recommended that we really shift away from tourism. And what they've seen, since 9/11 in these 20 years is that actually we have become more and more reliant on tourism in terms of jobs. The job creation has been most in tourism, right? So that means that we are, continuing, we are not making that shift. We are not thinking alternatively. And, when we just looked at all the alternative plans, like the feminist economic recovery plan and other plans, there are so many good ideas there. And it's how do we get policymakers to hear these ideas instead of doing the same old, because they are just comfortable with, the economy being like this. There are big corporate, interests that they are protecting, but we really need to shift gears, and that will only happen when we just say no, and this is not, this is not sustainable. We are not going to go along with this. And again, what really, drives this home for me as a professor is that, so many of my brilliant students, I see them working in the tourist industry after their bachelor's, and that is because there are no other jobs. Nobody has, sort of hooked them up with other jobs, right? And they are also, you know, they are in Hawaii because they love this place or they have family responsibilities. So you know, I'm like, why aren't we thinking about other job opportunities? You know, when these folks are, you know, so innovative, so, you know, driven, you know, and then you end up like serving people. This kind of hits me, like, this is not to denigrate the work itself. The, you know, like service work is, you know, like I value it, but it's also like, you know, how can we shift gears so that people are doing, there's a match between what they're getting educated for and what they're paying for in terms of their education and, you know, what they're managing to do later. So yeah. Hey, Rich, do you want to join in and just, we're talking about hotel workers. So I'm going to quickly ask Rich to join the conversation just about our report and, you know, the issues of workers' rights and racial justice and tourism and its sustainability. And, you know, I haven't talked about the ways in which, you know, when we did the research, how frontline workers have been the most vulnerable in terms of returning to work.
Yeah. So, hi, it's really lovely to see you all. I've also been part of Aikea and part of the Local 5 discussions that led to it, and constantly harassing them to do stuff that they already do, which is basically look beyond the craft union model to the wider community, because well, anyway, I'll set all that aside because that's like years of backstory. But Local 5 has been like a fantastic experience for me, just because they've been open to the community. When the community speaks, people actually listen, and they try to incorporate things in as best they can. And part of the issue is that union is designed to get the most impact from what their resources are. So they have a tendency to help those who are kind of the upper echelon of the people in need, and they miss the most vulnerable workers because they're spread around. So, you know, like the big hotels will be unionized because that's where they get the most impact from the union. But the small mom and pop places might be using undocumented immigrants who have language problems and are afraid of being deported. So they work for less than minimum wage and kind of in, you know, bad circumstances. And there's this whole range. And what I love about Local 5 is they've been open to having discussions about that. And there's this new organization they launched on May Day. Are you guys familiar with the Hawaii Workers Center yet? So yeah, they're trying to fill in, you know, reach the people that the union can't reach. And to their awesome credit, Local 5 has been a real ally with the Workers Center instead of viewing it as competition. And that's what we need to do, even though there's a tendency to kind of try and divide workers against each other. So front of the house versus back of the house was the big divide. When I worked in restaurants for 15 years, I was a cook, and you know, and I had an issue with this when the restaurant workers union or organization like went for the higher wages for people in the front of the house, and I'm like, they're the ones who get paid the most. The cooks and the dishwashers get paid nothing and don't get any tips. So I had a big fuss about that. But let me get around to the project that we're currently doing. What's gone on is that in the government discussions with what they think of as the community, pretty much Local 5 has had a few conversations with legislators. I don't think they've been able to get the governor's ear much at all. But they've the legislature has been a little better than the governor's office and the mayor's office, but for the most part, no one is consulting workers. Their idea of the community is business owners. So that's a real problem. But the way politics is structured these days, we're not really dealing with democracy. We're dealing with a version of corporate fascism where corporations spend so much money on lobbying, and they do this in Honolulu, you know, that they have the ears and the loyalties of the legislature and the governor's office kind of sealed up. So we're trying to get workers at the table, because what we found, and this is not a big surprise to anybody who's ever worked, are any of you working in hotels or have worked as cooks or waiters or food service or housekeepers? Okay, one person. Like, you know, because you do the job, you know what's best. And you also know that oftentimes management will come down with these crazy ideas, and it's like a Dilbert comic strip, you know, where management is saying, you know, well, maybe we should farm turtles on the moon. Workers actually know what's going on. And with COVID, they know when they're safe and they know when they're not. And business owners have compunction. They're compelled by the nature of capitalism and business to try and extract the most profit and the most work for the least amount of money from workers. That's what makes you a profitable business. So their interest is not in workers' health. And I don't want to make this a black and white thing, because it varies. You know, some employers are better than others. But until all employers are better, which is not the case, we need workers at the table because they actually are the ones that know what's going on. They know how to keep a room clean. They know what's impossible to clean. They know how long it takes. And they also know when it's not being done. So a lot of the places like in Las Vegas, and another really good example is Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, because they're a smaller tourist town than, you know, the Hawaiian Islands, but they opened up for Memorial Day, and they've had a huge uptick, you know, an explosion really of COVID cases. And Las Vegas, basically, they had very weak rules because they have a governor and a mayor who border on being libertarian. You know, they're like, the businesses can decide for themselves, and that's freedom to oppress workers how they want to. So they actually almost as soon as things reopened, attention to cleaning protocols and safety measures were just thrown out the window, and it went back to business as usual because that's the cheapest way to operate. Workers knew this, pointed it out, fought against it, but were unable to get enough traction yet, because they're still fighting in Las Vegas, and the unions are actually big there, so we have a local there too. So they're actually fighting, you know, to get workers at the table, because business left to its own devices will not look out for its own interests, really, because it's human capital is its most valuable thing. And I'm realizing I'm using sort of objectifying language even in saying that, but I'm taking it from a business perspective, that they actually have a capitalist interest in taking care of their workers that they ignore because of who knows. Not all of them, and again, I don't want to make this a black and white thing, but as long as there's some, when you're in a situation of a pandemic, that means infections spread rapidly and can explode exponentially. So workers need to be at the table in order to both plan the plans, implement them, evaluate them, and enforce. So if they're not there at each of these steps, workers' interests are not going to be taken care of. And without workers' interests being taken care of, we've already seen the results in Myrtle Beach, in Florida, in Las Vegas. that basically the pandemic spreads exponentially, which has not happened this time in Hawaii, but anybody that's read a little bit of Hawaiian history knows that it has happened before with tragic, tragic results, you know, devastation of the Hawaiian population. So I've really gone off on a little rant there. So I'll be quiet now and turn it back over to you guys.
No, thank you so much for that. I think it really brings into the light like the current situation, especially with all of the COVID pandemic and how it affects like especially workers' rights, and just like rights in general, especially in this day and age where we're looking not only at race but also highlighting different issues about amongst workers and like their ability to live and to feel safe. So I thank you so much for talking about that. But I guess both of you guys can go ahead and answer this question, but I know you guys talked a lot about, you know, collaborative efforts and, you know, getting workers to come together. And I guess even for youth who are trying to like, you know, fight a good fight, what do you think is needed to effectively create successful community-based initiatives?
Listening, so I'm going to be quiet.
You know, I was sort of thinking because, you know, I mean, this builds on the question, your previous questions. Yeah, you know, how do we get community to mobilize? You know, those of us who are already in the fight, like how do we have other people join in, right? And, you know, and again, the argument is always about jobs, right? Like scaring people about, oh, you're not going to have jobs, or you know, like just take this job or go back to your job because we need the money. So using people's, you know, economic devastation as a way to push them into unsafe conditions. And, you know, this has been the story for a long, long time. And I think the pandemic has only sort of made very visible what, you know, what this is. So I think that the first thing is maybe, you know, I'm drawing on, you know, my Native Hawaiian colleagues who talk about sort of like bringing in conversations about abundance instead of scarcity, right? So focusing the conversations about what is in abundance in our communities and build on that instead of the scarcity mentality, which is completely tied to capitalism, right? Because it's like jobs are scarce, money is scarce, food is scarce, so let's just do whatever we can to get through this, right? So, I mean, why? You know, why are we going to settle for the least, you know, what is the least best for us and our communities? So I think that, you know, sort of starting the conversation from abundance, from a space where we are not feeling like we are in a corner, even though we are in a corner with this pandemic. But I think that people are getting more and more aware, you know, of the ways in which, like, you know, people are scared about dying and what will happen to their families and they don't have health care, you know. I think that these inequities are now very visible to them. So, you know, I think that it's a good time to draw them into these conversations and sort of say, we're going to go back to work under conditions that really ensure our community safety and security, which is also, you know, this conversation about defunding the police, right? I mean, what are we really asking for? We're not only just saying, oh, defund the police or reform the police, we're saying, put those funds in life-giving resources. Like, you know, we need those funds for food, we need those funds for education, we need those funds for parks, for childcare, you know, like, all this money that is like being pumped into the police, like use them in other ways, right? Other life-giving, life-sustaining ways. Give people health insurance, you know? So I feel like that's kind of the conversation that, you know, this is the opportunity that's it's opening up for us, you know, the racial justice conversation about defunding the police, because together with that comes, okay, what are we going to fund with that? We're going to defund, but what are we going to fund, and have those conversations. And then, you know, I think the other thing that's become very apparent is that, you know, at every stage we see that profit is being put in, you know, before people, right? And I think that we need to bring those slogans back again and have those conversations about, you know, we need everyone, like starting with our policymakers, to put people before profit.
So on organizing, I said listening, and it sounded a little facetious when I said it. But what has kept me and many others drawn us to Local 5 and Aikea and many other organizers in Hawaii and elsewhere for us. I don't know about you guys, but we sort of trooped around a little bit. That actually listening is really an important thing for organizers to do. And just figure what drew you into activism. It probably, if you're like me, I don't know if you are or not, but it was something inspired you and you felt like you could speak up on a subject where maybe in other contexts you would feel like you could not speak up on that subject. So I really think providing an open listening space that reaches out to people. So doing the outreach is important, and Local 5 has the institutional structure to do that like fantastically. So they're kind of awesome at it. They're watch and learn is all I can say there. That's what I would do. That's what I do.
Say that the kitchens were where you learned your politics.
Yeah, and I learned my politics in kitchens from talking to other workers and figuring out how things worked. Like we knew exactly how we were valued. And you know, workers do have an abundance of skills in the kitchen. So, you know, where I was, it wasn't a union town. When I worked in kitchens, I could quit a job if I wanted to go catch a concert and get another job when I came back, because I knew I had the skills and they needed me as much as I needed them. So my power wasn't to get better wages or health insurance. It was to basically carve out free time when I wanted it. And taking a vacation meant, see you later. So unions offer a much more stable and substantial version of workers' rights, but workers know the deal and they know their rights, and they you know, if they don't get them one way, they get them another way.
Yeah, thank you. I think,
and that is like partly from music, which is not a very good source for politics, but you know, Clash, Rage Against the Machine, that kind of stuff. But also just from working. Like I worked with other people and I learned a lot from working in the bottom rungs.
oh,
So
yeah,
anyway, I'm gonna go back to listening. What do you guys think? I wanna bounce the question back to you. What makes a movement attractive, and how do you go about, how will you go about like bringing people in together to have conversations about what you want to talk about?
Well, I think that was one of our goals of this initiative, is to have these conversations with experts like you guys, and to really like bring light into the situation, especially for youth who have felt empowered or saw the movements that are going across this country, you know, to have that voice and to understand, like you said, listening. And I think being able to talk to you guys, and also if for those who get to see this interview later on, to be able to listen into these conversations and also feel empowered, like, hey, you know, I feel that I resonate with what is being discussed. I resonate with what is being said, and you know, I want to go ahead and push for those initiatives. I want to be part of that change. And I think a lot of us here in this conversation, a lot of us youth do feel the same way, especially are passionate about, you know, the work that we are doing and what we hope to come out of these this youth advocacy initiative that we are working on. And I just hope that, I'm just very grateful to have had the conversation with you guys, especially, and I'm pretty sure all of my peers here as well agree that we are very grateful to have had you guys on board. We did pass our 45-minute mark on this conversation, but no, thank you guys so much for talking. I think there's no time limit on knowledge and just being able to speak.
Yeah. Well, keep us in the loop. This can be the start of the conversation, not the end of it.
Definitely, this is just the start of the conversation. And I guess if you guys have any final words or final saying to anyone who's out there watching this conversation later on.
I just feel very lucky and honored to be to have taken part in this and to, hear your questions and your thinking. And, what you said about being part of the change is like, that's in a nutshell everything that I would love to see through this work, So thank you for all the work that you do. The boots on the ground, that's you.
So, and I want to thank you guys for inviting Monisha and Monisha for letting me kibitz. So,
Definitely. Thank you guys so much for thank you guys so much for coming on board, taking time out of your day, and we truly appreciate it. And we hope that to all who is watching out there, that you feel empowered by these conversations and go out there and make your own advocate for the initiatives that you feel empowered to do so. So thank you again, and I guess we can go ahead. Yeah.
Bye. Thanks so much.
you.
Bye.